All right, so I'm going to read more of the Anarchy and Christianity book by Jacques Ellul. I guess is how you pronounce his last name. Look, if you're like me, you're political, you're engaged, you're a reader, you don't hesitate to talk to people. You realize America is a land of opportunity. America is good. It's certainly not. It's certainly not perfect. No one ever said it was. My goodness. And you feel like if only the politics of the day of yours would reign supreme, things would be better. Look, I felt like that. Again, I've said this to you a million times. When Reagan won in 1980, I just remember my mom crying, and essentially we thought we're all going to get nuked. And that led me to believe, well, if Reagan didn't win, she wouldn't cry, and thus we'd be safe, essentially. And so you can see how politics gets ingrained in one, at least for me. And now, if we have the right political system, we can be happy, and that's of course communistic. But it's even for those of us on the right as well. If George W. Bush wins, life will get better. If John Kerry wins, life will get worse. And thus, it's imperative that we elect George W. Bush. In hindsight, that was just silly. It turns out to be silly. I'm not quite sure. I think 2016 was a big. If Hillary would have won, I think it would have gotten worse quickly. But then Trump won, and how quickly it's gotten worse, actually, with the Republican in the Senate and the Republican in the House initially, and the Republican in the presidency. The politics have been, just the society and the decadence, the decay is happening all around us, and so we can turn to politics, but it's not salvation. It's just not. Christianity and Jesus is the only salvation there is. And sometimes you need a kick in the pants to recognize that. And I know that's what I need. And I've gone away from the traditional Republican Party, from which I escaped to in the '90s, and then escaped from after Mitten's insanity in 2000, and again probably 2014 is when I recognized that the insanity of the Republican Party, as it were, and then in 2016, of course. But even with Trumpster in there, I realized that relying on politics to bring salvation is not going to happen. I think a lot of people on the left did that with Obama as well. They thought Obama would bring salvation. The way he spoke, the waters would recede, and all this was nuts. But I think a lot of people literally bought into that. And then when it didn't happen, when salvation doesn't occur, even though your guy is promising it, you have to focus your blame on someone who stopped it, which would be in this case the anti-left, which is whoever they call fascist, Nazis. That's who it is. Anyone who got in the way of the Bernie Bros and whatnot. And we can see the same thing on the right. So this is where this book comes into play, Anarchy and Christianity, because at the end of the day, the only true salvation is through Jesus, man. That's it. And there's no other way around that. Now, that does not mean you just don't engage. In fact, I'll read you. I read this part of this last night on my live stream, but I'm going to read you from the beginning, which is pretty, just pretty profound. Hold on just a second. Right here. All right. Provided all adultery and pretension are debunked in favor of modesty, humility, and truth, political participation could be a symbolic way of standing alongside our neighbors. After all, this is the guy who wrote the introduction to this book. After all, Ellul, who wrote the book actually, and we don't abandon the church despite its conformity, weakness, and failure to live up to its charter. So too, we will not abandon the state and politics despite their corruption, hypocrisy, and failure. If for no other reason, such participation is a reminder of the fact that God will not stop participating in our lives despite of what we are. So basically, I just think that's credible, because what the anarchists would say is basically tune out, don't be involved in all. And I'm not sure that's the way I want to go, because actually I think you have to engage. And if you look at like what happens in Turkey and Iraq and whatnot, where the out parties don't engage, they get steamrolled, and next thing you know, you got a freaking Erdogan just taking over, and the whole thing is nuts, and there's no looking back. You got a Chavez, you got in Iraq, same thing. So what happens is if you don't engage at all, your voice will never be heard and they will be steamrolled. And I don't think that's good either. So you got to find this fine line between engagement politically and not being reliant on the political battles at hand to make you live a good life, if that makes sense. So let's just read. This is the Bible as a source of anarchy. Now remember, Ellul, Jacques, is a guy coming from the perspective that that you should not engage at all. You should just tune out, essentially, like Tim O'Leary says. Whatever it was, Tim Leary, is that his name? Timothy Leary. Tune out. Just don't get involved. Like an Amish. That's not what the initial point that the guy who wrote the foreword for this, foreword to the 2011 edition, a guy named David Gill. I'm not familiar with David, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying, look, engage, but recognize that God is the ultimate authority, and God still engages with you, even though you're corrupt. Thus, you should still engage with politics, even though it is corrupt. If nothing else, be as a part of a community. So that's a tough one, though. But anyway, the Bible as a source of anarchy. All right, we commonly talk of sheer anarchy when we see disorder. That is because we in the West are convinced that order can be established in society only by a strong central power and by force. To challenge power of this kind necessarily means disorder. So if order is the establishment and anarchy is disorder, inherently anarchy is, then anarchy is going to be disorder, which is not what we want. We want a strong central force for order. Luther, for instance, was so frightened by the disorder of the peasants' revolt, a consequence of his preaching of Christian liberty, which peasant groups accepted and wanted to manifest at once, that he quickly called upon the princes to suppress the uprising. Calvin could even say that anything is better than social disorder, even tyranny. So we have, Luther, Calvin basically saying, suppress the uprising, and tyranny is even better than disorder. And disorder they're calling as anarchy. I quote these two authors because they're the closest to me as a Protestant, in order to show that even faithful readers of the Bible and true Christians can be blinded by the obvious usefulness of kings and princes, and thus they can read the Bible only through that filter. But today, confronted with the crushing of individuals by the state under every regime, we need to challenge this behemoth and therefore to read the Bible differently. All right. And he talks about, it is true enough, as we shall see, that there are also in the Bible text which seem to validate authority. But as I will show you, I believe that is the general current which points towards anarchy, the passage that favor authority being the exceptions. All right, so he talks about the Hebrew Bible first. God did not necessarily choose people of distinguished family or health. Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Samson were more prophets than kings. They had no permanent power. God alone could be considered the supreme authority. A significant phrase at the end of the book of Judges is that at that time there was no king in Israel. People did what was right in their own eyes. Proof may be found in the story of Abimelech in chapter 9 of Judges. Abimelech. One of the sons of Gideon, with no mandate from God, decided that since he was the family of him who had saved Israel, he ought to succeed his father in office. He began by assassinating all his brothers. He then assembled the inhabitants of Shechem and Milo, or Beth Milo, and proclaimed himself king. But the prophet Jotham opposed him, and addressing the people, he told them an interesting parable. The trees gathered to elect a king and put him at their head. They chose the olive, but the olive refused, saying that his job was to produce good oil. They then chose the fig, but it made a similar response. Shall I give up my sweetness and the excellent fruit which I bear in order to be above the other trees? But the trees wanted a king. They chose the vine, but the vine answered like the first two. Then they approached the bramble, which accepted and stated at once that those who disobeyed would be burned by it. Having denounced Abimelech, Jotham had to flee. Abimelech reigned for 3 years. The Israelites, accustomed to freedom, then began to revolt. Oppression and massacres resulted, but after his victories over the rebels, Abimelech was passing a tower, and a woman up in the tower threw a piece of millstone on his head and crushed his skull. The system of judges was then restored. The real history of royal power, central and unified power, would only begin with the familiar story in 1 Samuel chapter 8, where Samuel was now a judge. But the assembled people told him they now had enough of this political system. They want a king to be like other nations. Man, you got to read the book of Samuel. It's fascinating. They wanted a king. They also thought a king would be a better military leader. Samuel protested and went to God in prayer. The God of Israel said, "Do not be upset. The people have not rejected you, Samuel, but me, God. They have constantly rejected me since I liberated them. Accept their demand, but warn them of what will happen." Hence, Samuel returned to the assembly of the people of Israel and told them that since they wanted a king, they should have one. But they had to know what the king would do. He would take their sons and make soldiers of them. He would take their daughters for his harem or his domestic servants. He would impose taxes and confiscate their best lands. The people replied, however, that they did not care. They wanted a king. Samuel warned them again that they would cry out against this king, but nothing could be done. He who has chosen to be king thus came on the scene, namely Saul, who, as we all know, became mad and committed all kinds of abuses and was finally killed in battle against the Philistines. The second king, David, enjoyed great renown. He was Israel's greatest monarch. He was constantly held up as a model. I've written elsewhere that he was the exception among Israel's kings, but Bernard Ellul is harsher than I am. He thinks David is a good example in favor of anarchy. A first reason is that one of the passages, 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 7 through 9, shows that David did nothing on his own. It was God alone who acted through him. His glory owed nothing to his own sake, but solely to God's benevolence. Ellul then shows that during the reign of David, David, all these things that in later centuries would bring successive disasters on Israel. This is obviously important. In France, Louis XIV would do all the things which led to the political mistakes of the 18th century and hence the revolution. Furthermore, the Bible curiously insists upon all of David's faults: the killing of his rivals, the arranging of the death of the husband of the woman whom he desired. Remember that with Uriah? The incessant civil wars of his reign, etc., so that David is not presented in any way as blameless or glorious. And then after David came Solomon, his son. Solomon was just and upright, but then power went to his head as it did with his others. He imposed crushing taxes, built ruinous palaces, and took 700 wives and 300 concubines. He began to worship other gods beside the God of Israel. He built fortresses over the whole land, and when he died, he was hated by everyone. Man, that's crazy. In my view, the whole story is worth telling because it shows how the Bible is how severe the Bible is even on the great kings. It is severe precisely because of the degree that those kings represented in their day the equivalent of a state, an army, a treasury, an administration, and centralization. We can say that the biblical accounts good kings are always defeated by Israel's enemies, and the great kings who win victories and extend their borders are always bad. Good means they are just and they don't abuse their power and that they worship the true God of Israel. Bad means they promote idolatry, reject God, and are also unjust and wicked. We can say that in biblical accounts, good kings are always defeated by Israel's enemies, and the good means they did not abuse their power. Furthermore, the accounts were not preserved, but were regarded as divinely inspired. Were not merely preserved, they were regarded as divinely inspired. They were treated as a revelation of the God of Israel, who is thus presented as himself as enemy of royal power and the state. They were sacred texts. They were included in the body of the inspired text. There was yet no canon. They were read in synagogues, even though they must have seemed like an anti-royalist propaganda to rulers like Ahab. They were commented upon as the word of God in the presence of all people. To me, an astonishing fact which gives evidence of the dominant thinking of the Jewish people from the 8th to the 4th century BC. This to me, there is an astonishing fact which gives evidence of the dominant thinking of the Jewish people from the 8th to the 4th century. Basically, anti-royalist propaganda. All right, so I'm going to pause here. We'll go to another one here in just a second, part 2.